just over 10 years ago. I was fresh out of college and had moved back to my parents' house for free rent and food for 9 months, right before I was leaving state for graduate school. To earn some scratch, I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner that my dad knew. They had a business where you could rent low-level farm equipment, a small mom-and-pop type thing in sticks. Since they knew my family, they trusted me to go in there for about 15 or 20 hours a week and check and file rental forms, make sure nobody missed a payment, or answer an email, or discuss prices, availability, etc. Super easy gig. The old building where I worked was about 90 years old and at the top of this little hill. I could work any hours I wanted to, as long as the work got done, so I'd usually go in after 7 PM and stay until around midnight or 1 AM. Since I knew I'd be alone, I could listen to music loud and take my time. The office was on the second floor of the building and looked out onto the long driveway. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, but I was so desperate to get out of the house, so went into work at about 8 PM. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill, since, believe me when I say that, nobody ever showed up at night. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. To even turn onto our short road, you had to only be coming to our specific building and know it was there beforehand. So I was jamming away to some Fall Out Boy and having some coffee, and I kept glancing at the snow outside as I worked, since our one orange streetlight reflected onto the ground at the gate, and that was causing light to shine off the snow in a really cool way. Around midnight, I went downstairs to do my bathroom business, then came back upstairs and got settled back into work. I probably did about 5 minutes of work, when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the orange light. It seemed like a huge dog or substantial animal had just rolled around on the ground on their back or something. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened while I was in the bathroom. I shook it off and assumed an animal was attracted to the orange light or something. At around 2 AM, I was leaving and got out of my car to lock the gate. And to be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow, but it was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. I used to make snow angels when I was a kid, and they're also very recognizable, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was. But it wasn't from a kid, it was from a very large person. And I already knew, whoever had made this snow angel could easily have looked up and have seen me through that window, so they must have waited for me to head downstairs to the bathroom to make this snow angel. No cars had pulled up into our building. I would have seen or heard them, even from the bathroom. So I glanced around for footprints in the snow and saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods to the right side of our building. It was clear that the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which instantly made me uneasy, since that side was just trees and darkness for miles and miles. By now, I was freaking out and trying to get back to my SUV. And that's when I heard it. Before I could get inside, I heard a loud, high-pitched laughing coming from the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like the witch in The Wizard of Oz, like someone was doing it to fake on purpose. It was close enough that I knew they could see me, but I couldn't see them at all, since other than that street light I was under, there was no illumination. After a few seconds of laughing, it stopped. And then it was just silence everywhere, except for my heart's beating through my ears. Then the laughing started again, though louder this time, more like screaming and laughing combined. I sort of froze for like 5 seconds, listening in panic. Now, I spent a lot of time in that area, and I know what coyotes and foxes sound like at night with their high-pitched screeches during mating season, but this was very, very human. It felt like it was an adult male trying to emulate a woman laughing, like someone was deliberately trying to make a fake scary shriek laugh in order to scare someone. Well, it freaking worked. After 5 seconds, I immediately filled up with adrenaline, got in my car and drove the hell away from there as fast as I could without sliding off the road. I worked there for another 6 weeks or so and never had a single issue. though I knew where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there before I started my shift. And I certainly always locked that gate from then on. So, my uncle used to work a lot when I was younger. He's done a lot of different things to make money, but one consistent thing is that in summer months and into late fall, he paints houses. It's a legitimate business and everything. He's got a truck with a number and a name and supplies in the back, the real deal. Every now and then he would call my dad when he needed a little extra help, and I'd work for him. No big deal really, it's just painting houses. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it takes a while to paint the whole house. If the weather conditions aren't right, then you can't paint. One particular fall was extremely wet. It rained what felt like every single day. My uncle would paint multiple houses at a time, so sometimes he would get caught up due to situations like these, and at work a little more than usual. That was fine by me though. The job wasn't hard and it paid very well. Anyway, it was a warm day for late fall, but there was still a distinct chill in the air. One that kind of penetrated through you and stung your soul. My uncle had this job he had to finish. It was an old Victorian house in a quiet part of a town. An old lady and her husband, who was an author, lived there. Due to the weather, it had taken longer than expected to paint the house, and there were family issues going on at the time, which further complicated things. So, my uncle gets a call one day from the lady who lives in the house. She says that her husband is trying to write his next book, but he keeps getting distracted by the scaffolding outside the house, so she wanted to know if we could come over and finish the job as soon as possible. My uncle was always an honest businessman. They had contracted him to do the job in midsummer, but he had lots going on that summer, and the wet conditions I mentioned made it difficult to finish anything. However, these people were insistent, but really polite, and not wanting to lose customers or get bad recommendation, my uncle decided to put the house as high priority. After all, it would only take a day or two to finish. So, we show up to this house mid-afternoon. Like I said, it was a weird kind of chilly that day, and I also remember a really eerie calm. As we arrived, we moved straight to the back. The front of the house was already been done, so there was nothing left to do there. My uncle, being the more experienced painter, would always do the touch-ups, and I would simply apply the first coats, since they took little skill. Anyway, we get to the back, and he asks me if I'm scared of heights. I was 17 at the time, and although they do creep me out a little, I didn't want to seem like a child to my uncle, so I told him I wasn't. He was happy to hear that. He has me climb up to the scaffold to the 3rd floor to finish an upper section of the house. There was a window up there, a small little oval one that looked into the attic. The attic also happened to be the husband's study. He would do most of his writing in there. So I'm climbing up the scaffolding, cans of paints dangling behind me, and various paintbrushes and other tools in the utility belt my uncle let me borrow. I get to the top of the scaffolding and set all my supplies down. I crack open a can of paint and start painting like he taught me. Outside of the temperature, the overcast, and the eerie calm, this day was like any other. I'm working my way across the top part of the house when I get to the window that looks into the study. I bend down, dip my paintbrush, and stand back up to paint above the window. The window was in direct line of sight, and I couldn't help gazing in. I see a man, the husband, staring back at me with a face completely barren of any emotion. I had never seen a face so devoid of feeling before. Of course, I get startled and take a step back. I chuckle and smile at the guy, but he doesn't smile back. Instead, while remaining completely emotionless, he turns his back to me and walks out of the study. I continued painting, when all of a sudden, I hear a loud bang, a muffled explosion almost. I freaked out. I thought my uncle fell from a great height on the scaffold below him. As I climb down to check what's going on, I hear the old lady scream at the top of her lungs. The old man had shot himself in the upstairs bathroom. Alerted by the gunshot, my uncle fell off the scaffolding from the 2nd story. He was lucky enough to land in a bush and only suffer a broken ankle and a few scratches. The biggest wound that day happened to our mental health. I had to go to counseling for a while. It's been years since then, and I still remember that man's face. I've never forgotten it. It would always be burned in the back of my head. Now I know why. Looking back, his face was so devoid of emotion, because he never felt any emotion at all. He literally didn't care about anything he was doing. As it turns out, the man was seriously depressed and facing marital issues with his wife. Combined with a few too many nights drunk on whiskey and facing writer's block, I guess he decided he couldn't take it anymore. His wife moved out of the house shortly after, and we never finished the job. To this day, that house remains abandoned, and I try not to drive down the street it's on. I'm scared that if I do and happen to pass the backyard, I'll see that man's face staring back at me from the window, cold and emotionless. Fresh out of nursing school, I got my first real job in a fairly large hospital, in a department that I honestly never thought I would ever work in. It was a 6-bed cardiac ICU, with rooms that overlooked the city capitol building. It was a very nice unit, and I started out working 12-hour night shifts. The hospital I worked at had 4 other ICUs that were always full, so my unit always ended up being code bed, meaning if someone was arrested or went downhill fast somewhere around the hospital, they came to us. I had been working there for over a year now, and I was no stranger to death. Each patient of mine who had died on my shift was usually already on their way out. Their families were by their side, the DNR order was signed, and the funeral home was already picked out. It was rarely ever a surprise. In fact, the only time I was ever needed to do CPR on my shift, it was not even my department. So I went on a nice long 2-week vacation, got engaged, and had a beautiful tan. On my first night back, I received a report from the day charge nurse. She said she was off for a few days, and suggested to remind the next day charge nurse that the priest was coming in the morning to bless room 4. I thought she was kidding at first, but she was serious. Apparently, while I was on vacation, every patient who was admitted to that room had died. But this came as no shock to me. People died often in our department, and it being a very religious institution, having a chaplain for almost every department, I just shook it off. Then she said room 4 was empty, and that it would serve as code bed for the night. Around 2 a.m., I got a call saying that they have someone to fill our open bed. The ICU downstairs was now going to be code bed, so we were getting your run-of-the-mill chest pain, take a look in the morning kind of patients. Nothing to get excited about at all. We get the patient admitted and all settled in room 4. He was a gentleman about 50 or so years old, very pleasant. His wife was with him, and she looked dead on her feet. I got her some warm blankets, and took her to our waiting room that had cots so she could get some rest. Around 3:30, I was watching monitors and the cameras in each room. All the patients were fast asleep. The cameras all cycled through about 3 seconds on each small TV we had on the desk. Room 1 was fine. Room 2 was fine. Room 3 was fine. Room 4, there was some kind of blurred shadow in there. It cycled too quickly for me to get a good look, and the doors to the unit were locked. Maybe the other nurse let his wife back in. I walked down the hall and glanced inside. There was nobody. I shrugged it off. It was late, and I was tired. I was probably just seeing things. I went back to my desk and continued watching the screen. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, Room 4. I was not imagining anything. There was someone in Room 4. There was some kind of shadowy blur standing in the room's corner. I could not move my body. It cycled through again. This time, it was closer to the patient's bed, by maybe 2 or 3 feet. The hair stood straight up on my neck. The next time it cycled through, it was even closer. It stood directly in the light coming from the hallway, but despite the light, it was still shrouded in darkness. It cycled through again, and it was right next to the bed. My heart started pounding, and I could barely speak to the nurse on the other end of the desk. As soon as my words formed and I was able to make some kind of noise to get her attention, the alarm on the monitor went off, signaling that the patient had a cardiac arrest. The overhead system came on. A card is needed in CCU room 4. People poured into the department. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, respiratory therapists. They all rushed into the room, but I couldn't move. It cycled through the rooms again. Room 4 came up, and this time the lights were on, and there were 10 to 15 people surrounding the bed, doing CPR and slamming meds into his IV. Someone went to get his wife from the waiting room, but it was too late. The man died of a heart attack. Room 4 was blessed that morning, right on schedule, and I put in my 2 weeks notice. I couldn't handle it anymore. This happened to me during my first year of university in October. I was living in the dorms, and I need to give you a brief rundown of them. You need a keycard to gain access to your specific floor. So even though someone on the 3rd floor and 4th floor live in the same building, they can't access each other's floors. I had injured myself playing sports, so I was under the orders to rest, which meant no Halloween parties for me. Pretty sad for a horror fiend like myself, but to try and make the time a happy one, I busied myself to help making costumes for other people and doing their makeup. Once I was finally finished, I packed up my makeup and decided to watch some movies in my room. A guy popped up and introduced himself. We chatted a bit and exchanged email addresses, and I walked back to my room and said goodbye. The first warning sign was that he walked into my room behind me, despite me saying I was going to walk into my room. I felt really awkward and tried to say in a roundabout way that he needed to leave. But he wasn't getting the hint. I finally had to say, "You need to leave my room, now." I chalked this up to him maybe being drunk or something, but I wonder how he got onto the floor if he wasn't with anyone partying. Before I went to bed that night, I checked my mail and there were 5 from him. The first being, "Hey, I'm so glad we're friends," and the rest asking why I wasn't online. A few days later, I got a knock on my door when I was studying, and it was him. I explained that I was studying and needed privacy. He tried to walk into my room again, but I braced my arm on the frame and said firmly that I needed to study. The next day he was at my door again, and the next. I began pretending that I was not home. Another day there was a knock at my door, and when I checked the peephole, there was no one there, and I assumed the postman had come. I opened the door, and lo and behold, it was the creepy guy. He had begun hiding from the people so I would be more likely to answer the door. I told my roommate never to open the door if he was there, and I told people living on my floor that this guy was beginning to creep me out. So if he wanted to get on the floor, whatever sob story he gave them, don't let him in. A few days after that, I was on the bus coming home and I got a text from someone who lived on my floor, telling me not to come home because the creep was on my floor and he was sitting right in front of my door, just waiting. I went to a friend's house and spent the night, and when I got home, I was told he waited for 4 hours before leaving. At this point, I was getting freaked out. A few days after that, he began waiting outside the building, and if I left, he would follow me wherever I went. I was too spineless to tell him to go away, and I tried to be more passive about it. I never spoke, and never gave any indication I was paying attention, but he followed me to class, the cafeteria, and always tried to follow me home and get access to the floor. I finally went to the resident advisor, an older student that sort of watches over the floor, and told her what happened. She spoke to the RA of his floor, and was told that the creep had been telling his own RA that we were best friends and dating. My RA tried to explain that I was uncomfortable, but the other RA believed him, and that was that. Thankfully, one thing did scare him off. He would never approach me if I was with a whole group of people, so my floor mates banded together. If I went to dinner, I went with my floor, and if I wanted a drink or seconds, someone had to come with me. Walking to class and even waiting for the bus was done in a group. He got onto my floor once when someone else was coming home and he forced his foot in the door to let himself in. I was hidden in another room, and when he left my door to go and sit in the TV lounge waiting for me, I went downstairs and ran around to the other side of the building and got into my room before he noticed me. Then the phone calls began. I never gave him my number, but he somehow obtained my mobile and my room phone. At first it would be 1 or 2 phone calls a day, until I told him I wanted him to leave me alone. Then the calls began coming in every hour, with him begging and pleading for me to talk to him. Without caller ID, I needed to answer the phone because of school and my part-time job. At this point it was November, and I was a wreck. I was tired of having to plan out doing simple things like going for food or walking to a bus stop. Stress wasn't helping me recover from my injury, and I was losing weight, and I just looked sickly. I went back to the resident advisor and begged her to help me. She went to the head of the dorms and explained everything that happened. I explained how far this had gone, and my roommate told them that he had followed her a few times, demanding that she tell him where I was. I felt awful. She never told me this because she was afraid of upsetting me further, and I felt like I was an asshole for putting her through this garbage. I don't know what went on behind closed doors. From what I guess, he was told to leave me alone, and any further contact would result in him being kicked out of the dorms. There was one email where he went insane on me, telling me how awful I was. How could I do this to him? We were so happy together. Surely I was cheating on him with other men. After that, nothing. At first, when I'd see him around campus, I would run to the women's toilet to hide. I'd see him around town or on campus, and he'd always just stare at me. Never tried to approach me, never tried to get my attention, just staring. A few years ago, my anxiety was high. I was already at a point in my life where I thought I was a little out of it. But that was amplified a lot when I kept repeatedly hearing noises outside of my window. Like every single night, it just wouldn't stop. I would finally get so freaked out I'd go wake my parents up and get them to look outside, but they never found anything. I started to think I was going crazy, or subconsciously seeking attention. One morning, my grandfather discovered one of our lawn chairs beneath our bathroom window. It's pretty high up, and the bottom pane is fogged, so I'm not sure the chair even helped, but it was there regardless. The next night, heard sounds again. Nothing. The night after that one, however, we checked outside and discovered something that made my stomach cramp. A small stepladder was sitting directly outside of my window, bagged just enough to allow someone to sit on it but still see inside. On my windowsill was a bag of now cold McDonald's, which is just up the street from me. Most of the food was still in there, but still, some freak had been watching me, doing absolutely nothing of interest in my room without me even knowing for I don't know how long. The cops were called. Nothing happened. I felt crazier than ever. No one was to be found, but at least we had some evidence that someone that shouldn't be hovering around our house was at my window, watching intently through the blinds in the space between the 2 curtains. Heard noises again the next night. I ran outside, but of course, nothing. Earlier in the night I'd sewn my 2 curtains together, which hopefully made it harder to see in. Apparently it did, because now the freak had taken to climbing on top of our air conditioning unit, and from there, climbing onto our garage, then standing up on that so he could see above where the drapes went. The handprints and shoe prints were left on the lid to prove it. I should also mention that there were now holes in my sunscreen, and I heard these holes being created. He took a stick and sharpened it somehow. We found it outside of my window, and he was trying to stealthily break away the screen bit by bit. The next night I distinctly heard the gravel near my window crunch. There was simply no mistaking my sound. As quietly as I could, I let out a small moan he surely heard and rolled just out of view as if I were sleeping. Then pressed myself against the wall out of view of the window, very quietly opened my door and crept down the hall. My heart was pounding. Normally I knock on my parents' door, but I knew the slightest sound would make the bastard bolt, so I quietly opened their door and sneaked in. I informed them that there was, without a single doubt, someone outside of my window right now. They didn't mind my intrusion and got up. We got dressed, formulated a plan, and crept to the back door. I ran to the bathroom to stand on the edge of our tub and peek out the window, just as the back door was thrown open by my parents, who ran outside like morons. And sure enough, they saw him. They started screaming as the man leaped off of the Herbie and bolted down our driveway, which was the one I was looking at. Completely drenched in emotion, they screamed all sorts of horrible things at the top of their lungs. He ended up escaping across the street, hiding behind a house adjacent to us. The balls on this bastard. He kept peeking out at us as we all stood outside, but we wanted to leave him there so the cops could finally grab him. They were called, they came, and they searched, but they never found him. The bastard must have hopped the fence or some shit. Still to this day I hear sounds outside my window, even in the dead of winter, but he's never out there anymore. He might have just been a peeper, but he targeted me specifically and for months, until he was almost caught. What really pisses me off is that once he lost interest in me because it was too unsafe, he moved onto a house down the street with 2 little girls. He actually managed to get in through their window, and their dad caught him just standing in the middle of the room, watching them sleep. But to this day the bastard hasn't been caught yet. All I know is that it could have been worse, but it messed me up. I trust the men in my neighborhood even less now. The men around here stare very blatantly. All these years later I still hear stuff outside of my window and freak out. I turn out my lights entirely to exercise. I do my best to avoid the windows when I undress. The whole thing just scarred me, and it's something I'm going to have to deal with for the rest of my life. About a month after I joined Quora, I had an issue with a stalker. It was around the month of February 2018, and this was back when I was still new, not as popular as I am right now. This guy with an Arab sounding name had commented on one of my answers. It was a harmless comment, and so being naive and innocent to the online world of creeps, trolls and stalkers, I commented back politely like I used to do. A few minutes later, the guy commented again, and so we had a little back and forth comment thread going on. It wasn't until he said 2 simple words that the alarms in my head started to ring quietly. Friend me. Confused, I asked him what he meant, assuming it was a male looking at the name. He said he wanted to be my friend on Facebook, and when I told him politely and as nicely as possible that I didn't friend random people on social media unless I know them more, he became a different person. He started to spam comment and say information that he shouldn't have known about me. Like the name of my school, the name of my family business, and where I lived. He had found my Facebook page and could see the information about me. This is when the alarms in my head started to blare loudly, and I immediately blocked him and reported him, while my heart raced in my chest. Scenarios of him finding me and kidnapping me, hurting me, were flashing in my head and I was freaking out. At this time, I was friends with my ex. This was before we had started dating, and so I went to him and he calmed me down, and got a whole bunch of friends from Quora and hangout groups to block him and report him for harassment. After the guy found out I had blocked him, he purposely made another account with the same name, and started to spam comment again on the same answers. Thankfully my Quora settings were set that only people who I follow can message me, so he couldn't message me. I blocked him and I reported the second account immediately. I then changed my Facebook settings so that no one can see my personal information anymore, and I deactivated my account for about a week. After that, I never heard or seen him again. I am now very careful who I follow back, who I interact with, and I always make sure I check out the profile before following back. I do not want to go through that ever again. It scared the living hell out of me to this day. If I see a name like this, I tense up. So I advise everyone to be careful with who you interact. Yes, there are lots of extremely nice people. I've met so many amazing friends and people on social media. But there are always trolls and even stalkers who want to scare you, mess with you, or even hurt you. This is a true story from my mother's childhood. My mom is in her late 50s, and this happened when she was about 14 years old, around 1971 or 72 in Alabama. It was fall season, so this happened in October or November. My mom did not tell me this story until I was in college, and this creeped me out ever since. Here it goes. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She has 3 sisters and a brother, who is the baby of the family. One weekend in the cooler months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take the whole family, my grandmother, my mother, and all my aunts and uncles, so 7 people in total, into the woods for target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best neighborhoods, so my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with the rifle if they need to be. Since it was autumn, the trees were bare, and there were lots of dead leaves on the ground. The wooded area was just off a dirt road, so this was a fairly rural area they were in. Since it was so far off the beaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep in the woods. My mom remembers the car as being a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, his wife and kids were with him, so he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide under a pile of leaves in the woods. He hid with them. The man in the driver's seat got out, dragged the woman's body out of the car, and just dumped her there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure that the man had gone, everyone came out of hiding, and the woman sat up on her own and stared them straight in the face. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help, but she said no, she would be fine. She didn't seem to be injured and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with the man when he was dragging her out of the car. She must have known him maybe. So my grandfather cut the shooting lesson short and decided to rush the kids home to safety. He had plans to return to the area later. Well, on the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked their car, they passed a man in the blue Ford Galaxy driving slowly out of the woods. My mom looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seat right beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man could see that he was carrying a rifle, but everyone was careful not to give away what they have just seen. The man struck up small talk with my grandfather, asked him how he was doing and what they were doing out here in the woods. My grandfather explained that he was just taking his family out for some target practice with the rifle. The man told him to have a nice day and continued driving. The next day, my grandfather went back out to that spot in the woods. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of eyeglasses. He collected the items and took them home. According to my grandfather, that area of the woods was known for having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying that stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady! He killed that lady!" My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station, but my mom doesn't think anything ever came of it. She never heard anything else after that. Well, she did hear one other thing about it, I guess. Early next morning, my grandmother called my mom when she arrived at work, just before the kids left for school. My grandmother worked as a cashier and had to be at work very early in the morning, so my mother, being the eldest, was tasked with getting everyone else ready for school. My mother answered the phone, and my grandmother told her not to take the bus that day, that she would come home and pick all the kids up and drive them to school. When my mom asked why, my grandmother said, "Because that blue Ford Galaxy's waiting at the bus stop the whole day, and I don't trust any of it." This is the late 80s, early 90s. I was around 6 or 7 years old. I'm at home with my sister, who was 14 or 15 at the time. We grew up in a small Texas town. Everyone knows everybody. We were home alone this particular night, and my folks let my sister babysit me frequently. We always got along well due to our age gap. Anyway, it is about 8 p.m. in the winter. The desert gets pretty damn cold. So it is dark and we are in the common room, since that's where the TV was. We were watching 60 Minutes or 48 Hours or some stuff. Those 1-hour news pieces on CBS. This one was a typical story. Guy next door that was quiet went on a rampage in his next door's neighbor's house, mutilating them and kidnapping their younger daughter. Well, the thing about our house common room is the door leading to the backyard was a large glass door to the ceiling windows. So nothing but blackness beyond it, unless you have the backlight on, which we did not at the time. The front door is on the other side of the room with a small entryway. This is a solid door, so you cannot see what is beyond it, with a glass storm door on the outside of it. About 45 minutes into the show, they are talking about the ongoing manhunt for this crazy guy, and all of a sudden, bam bam bam, front door goes banging like crazy. We jumped up and screamed at the top of our lungs. Dead silence now. The only lights on in the house are the kitchen down the hall from the common room we were in, and the light from the TV. We started thinking that something on our porch had simply blown against the door. This was West Texas. Crazy strong winds out that way. Anyway, after a minute or two of silence and us holding each other, post-adrenaline overdose passes. Just when we are about to declare everything is safe, we hear the storm door on the outside of our front door close. Shit. Someone had to have opened that door to be able to bang on the front door like that. We are both frozen in the middle of the room, on the floor where we had been watching TV. My sister crawls over to the TV and turns it off. It was an old TV, so we had to turn that metal dial to switch it off, which it does with a mildly light thunk. Now it is just us in a room dimly lit by the kitchen light down the hall. I do not remember how much time passed with me frozen and my sister still crouched by the now off TV, but we kept making eye contact and then looking at the front door. I remember this next part vividly. I am on my knees, sitting on my feet, and I turn around to look at the back wall of windows and glass door. I see the back door knob turn. It was locked on a knob, but not that bolted. It rattles slightly as if someone is gently trying to handle. Neither of us make a sound, just held our breath. Then, bam, bam, bam. Loud as hell, someone is trying to force the door open, just jerking it back and forth. The whole back wall of windows is now vibrating violently. My sister went crazy and screamed murder. I am still frozen on the floor. She gets up and basically drags me into her bedroom, slams the door, throws her mattress and anything else she found in front of the door. Thankfully she had remembered the phone, one of those ungodly heavy beige plastic long metal antenna portable phones. We still had to direct dial the sheriff there, and in her panic she didn't remember the number. She just hit redial on the phone. It was one of her friends, and she tells them in broken gasp that someone is trying to get into our house and that we need help right now. I am curled up on the floor and cannot stop shaking. We don't hear anything else until we see the headlights of my sister's friend and her parents driving up to the house. We never did find out who it was at the door or why. There were no signs of anything happening but a couple of scuff marks on the bottom of the back door that we could not remember if they were there or not beforehand. Nothing like that has happened to me or my sister since, but for damn sure, we never forget to lock a door after that. About 4 years ago, I was ending my freshman year at college. I had lived in the dorms with a kick-ass roommate and pretty much had a great experience altogether. Towards the end of my last semester, something seemed different in my hall of the dorms. We were all still our lively selves, but just walking into the dorms would give you this massive feeling of dread. We all wrote it off as stress of the finals approaching, but it just felt off. One night after studying, I decided to hit the shower so I can just wake up and make my way to class in a few hours. Our hall was one of many halls on a single floor. Each hall had 4 rooms that accommodated 2 people each, or a single room for the RAs. The entrance to the halls were massive steel doors with a small window located on one end, and across from it was a bathroom. It seriously felt like a prison block rather than a living quarter for college students. As for the bathroom itself, when you walked in, you were immediately met with two sets of sinks. Two sinks aside, one on your left and one on your right, with a massive mirror facing each other, and creating that infinite loop of mirrors effect. Then past that you had two urinals and a toilet stall on your left, and two showers on your right. When facing the set of sinks, you can clearly see into the showers from the mirror. If the door is open, that is. The door of the bathroom was identical to the entrance door of the hall. A massive steel frame with a small window that didn't allow much of a view, with good reason of course. The door was propped open with a giant wooden wedge that couldn't be moved unless you were really trying to close that door. I'm all alone in the bathroom gearing up to go shower. I throw my change of clothes on the right side sink, so that way I can reach around the stall and grab them. Once I set my stuff down, I happen to look up into the mirror, and I can see in the distance something shimmering almost inside of the shower stall. As I look at it, I notice that it slowly gets closer, like it's jumping from the furthermost layer to the next layer. I'm kind of unsettled, but I don't think much of it, other than me coming down with a massive Red Bull, Adderall and caffeine kick. But it starts transitioning faster. As it gets closer, I can start making out details, but nothing vivid or striking. It's just a dark mass that looks like it's covered in hair. At this point I'm freaking out hardcore, since this thing is getting closer in the mirror and I'm pretty much frozen in this one spot. As it gets to the fourth layer, I get the closest look at this thing I'll ever get, and I regret every minute of it. It wasn't hair, but some kind of long flowing veil. You could see through it partially, but from the torso down it was just solid black. And the face, I can't describe it. It was clearly human, but at the same time, far from it. It had eyes. They were black but definitely glowing somehow. I only saw it for maybe a second at most, but it's burned into my mind forever. Then, the lights cut out and I hear the door slam. It's pitch black in the bathroom, so I can't see this thing anymore. I go to open the door but it won't budge. And then, this intense smell of blood hits me out of nowhere, and that's all I remember. I woke up later in the hospital. From what my RA claims, he was on his way to go and use the bathroom sometime after this happened, where he found me in the shower stall with my shirt covered in blood from a massive nosebleed. He tried asking me what happened, and according to him, all I could respond was, "It saw me," and I started freaking out. So he calls an ambulance, and they get me to the hospital. All the while, I'm apparently freaking out, so they had to sedate me to get me to calm down. I'm coming to around the time my parents show up, worried sick of course. I asked them what happened, and according to the doctors they believe I had a seizure. They ran a CAT scan soon after I was cooperative enough to do so, and found no sign of any seizure occurring. Not to mention epilepsy doesn't run in my family at all, and having taken Adderall countless times in the past, and since then, I've never had similar side effects, neither hallucinations or potential seizures. To this day, I still can't bring myself to look into a mirror for more than a minute, and just being stuck in a room with one for an extended period will just cause me to break down. I've been to therapy going on 3 years because of this, and I've talked to countless religious leaders who, besides giving me the general, "well, you should turn to God in times like these" talks, don't recognize that kind of pattern as anything demonic or evil. And the strangest thing is that before that incident, there were no actual claims of activity in those dorms, and since I left, there hasn't been any either. It was just that one isolated incident. This happened to me about 8 years ago, in my old parental house. I was home alone, and my parents were out for their anniversary dinner, leaving me in charge of our old Victorian house. I was pretty much your typical teenager, lost in the world of social media and homework, unaware of the dangers that lurk beyond the safety of our front door. As the dusk settled, the house always seemed to come alive with eerie creaks and noises. I tried to drown out the unsettling noises by turning up the volume on my favorite playlist, but an inexplicable feeling of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I shook it off, attributing it to my overreactive imagination. But just something deep within me told me otherwise. My parents had always emphasized the importance of safety, locking all the doors and windows before they left. So I didn't bother checking on it when they went out the front door. Despite my efforts to reassure myself, a nagging thought persisted. What if someone had been watching, waiting for this moment when I was home alone? I decided to busy myself with homework, attempting to bury my fears beneath the weight of textbooks and assignments. However, every little noise outside made my heart race. I tried calling my parents, seeking solace in their voices, but there was no answer. I remember a gust of wind rattled the windows, and I jumped. My nerves stretched to their limits. Then I heard it. A dull, almost imperceptible sound, like an old door being fumbled around with. I instantly muted my music, straining my ears to listen. Silence settled in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Just as I convinced myself it was only my imagination, I heard it again, this time more distinct. My heart lodged itself in my throat as I tiptoed to the window, peering into the darkness outside. There, at the back door of my house, a silhouette, a shadowy figure with malicious intent. Panic seized me, rendering me motionless. I knew I had to act to protect myself. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I sprinted to my parents' room, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon. My hands closed around a heavy brass lamp, its base cold and reassuring in my grip. Armed with newfound determination, I mustered the courage to confront the intruder. I crept downstairs, my every movement calculated and silent. At this point, the intruder had made it inside. Their presence now felt in the very air I breathed. My mind raced, thinking of escape routes, of the ways to defend myself if it came to that. I inched closer to the living room, my senses heightened, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the dim light, was a man, his face obscured by the shadows. Fear and anger mingled within me as I demanded to know his purpose. He didn't respond. He froze up, probably thinking he would not encounter anybody that night. I tightened my grip on the lamp, my knuckles turning white. I warned him to leave, my voice surprisingly steady despite my fear and rush of adrenaline. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step towards me, his intentions were clear. In that very moment, my instinct took over. I swung the lamp with all my strength, the metallic thud echoing through the room as it connected with his shoulder. He let out a cry of pain, stumbling backwards. It was my chance, my only chance. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could towards the front door. I could hear his footsteps right behind me, his enraged shouts filling in the air. I burst through the door, the cold night biting into my skin, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my neighbor's house. The police were called, and they searched our home. Another police unit found the intruder a couple of blocks away from my house, a man with history of violence and burglary. It turned out he had been watching our house. The police found a small cross scratched into our front door. This was a way of marking our house being empty. Groups of burglars do this to communicate when to strike. If it hadn't been for my quick thinking and courage, the situation could have ended much more differently. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled within me. The incident had changed something fundamental, something deep inside. I became more aware, more cautious, understanding that danger could lurk in the most unexpected places. Looking back, I realized how fragile a sense of security could be and how important it is to trust my instincts. I had faced my worst nightmare and emerged stronger. The experience taught me the value of bravery, reminding me that even in the face of paralyzing fear, we can find the strength to fight back and survive. A couple of years ago, I found myself in an unsettling situation. My husband was traveling out of state for work, leaving me alone in our quiet suburban home. On one particular evening, I decided to unwind by catching up on the latest news. I strolled into our cozy living room, where our Samsung Smart TV dominated the space. After powering it on, I placed the remote on the wooden coffee table and ventured into the adjacent kitchen to prepare dinner. As I moved pots and pans around, the soothing voice of the news anchor filled the air, providing me with a sense of companionship in my solitude. However, after a few minutes, a peculiar silence enveloped the room. I initially brushed it off, thinking that perhaps the signal had dropped or the TV had timed out and shut itself off, a not uncommon occurrence. I placed the knife I had been using to chop vegetables on the kitchen counter and headed back into the living room to rectify the issue. What I encountered sent shivers down my spine. The big TV screen, instead of displaying the news, showcased an image that was all too familiar. A couch in a living room, my living room to be precise. I stood there, paralyzed by shock and disbelief, trying to make sense of what was unfolding before my very eyes. The camera embedded in my smart TV had been activated, and it was streaming a live video of my own living room. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. Someone was watching me, spying on my every move, and invading the privacy of my own home. Fear gripped me, and my first instinct was to snatch the remote from the coffee table and switch off the TV. But the remote just laid there undisturbed, exactly where I had left it. There was no chance that my dog, who was lazily napping in the corner, had accidentally stepped on it and triggered this intrusion. I felt a growing sense of unease, a deepening pit of dread in the core of my being. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of my sister. She's a rational thinking person and tried to calm me down the best as she could. As soon as we laid down the phone, I pulled out the power plug from the backside of the TV. Scared to put it on again, I curled up underneath a blanket next to my loyal companion Loki. A few days later, the news broke, confirming our worst fears. Samsung Smart TVs had fallen victim to a widespread hacking issue, with malicious actors gaining unauthorized access to built-in cameras and microphones. The intrusion was not limited to my home. Countless others had unknowingly become victims of this insidious breach of privacy. To regain semblance of control, I placed a piece of opaque tape on the TV's camera, a small but symbolic act of defiance against the unseen eyes that had intruded into my life. The tape served as a reminder that in this digital age, even the most intimate corners of our existence could be exposed to prying eyes, hidden behind screens and codes. With the help of cybersecurity experts, I fortified my home network and took every possible measure to secure my devices. But the damage had been done, and the haunting feeling of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake the thought of how often I might have been spied on before I discovered this intrusion. The violation of my personal space, the invasion of my privacy, and the betrayal of trust left scars that ran deep. As the days turned into weeks, and the initial shock began to subside, I found solace in the support of people that had also been attacked. Together, we navigated the landscape of a world where technology had become a double-edged sword, offering both convenience and vulnerability. My experience served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that in our interconnected worlds, we must remain vigilant and safeguarding our privacy and personal spaces. I had just moved into my first apartment, a place that promised independence and new beginnings. The evening sky had already embraced the night, and I was alone, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture to make it feel like home. As the clock struck 8:30 p.m., a weird sound sliced through the silence. The doorknob was twisting, accompanied by a faint, persistent knocking. My initial excitement dissolved into a chilling realization. It was far too early for my friend to be back home from work, and the sound grew more ominous with every twist and knock. Fearing the worst, I peered through the kitchen window, hoping for a familiar sight, but there was no sign of his car or anyone else I knew. Panic clawed at my throat, as I comprehended the gravity of the situation. The doorknob continued its eerie dance, followed by the sound of metal scraping against wood, an intruder's attempt to gain entry. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity. As I retreated to the bathroom, clutching a knife, my trembling fingers dialing 911, I held my breath, praying for help to arrive in time. For what felt like ages, The intruder persisted, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the attempt ceased. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the intrusion itself. The police, my lifeline in that moment, arrived, their presence bringing a semblance of security. Their investigation soon revealed a chilling truth. The would-be intruder was an elderly man afflicted by dementia, a ghost from the apartment's past. He had once called this place home, his mind now muddled by the passage of time and disease. In his delusion, he believed I had stolen his belongings, a distorted reality that had driven him to my door. His intention, although misguided, had been fueled by a desperate need to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. Relief washed over me, mingled with a profound sadness for the man whose mind had betrayed him. I couldn't help but imagine the life he must have led within these very walls, now obscured by the fog of his deteriorating memory. The incident left an indelible mark on my psyche. The fear that had gripped me that night had settled into my bones, a constant companion. In the aftermath, I found solace in my safety, grateful for the instincts that had kept me from opening the door to a stranger. Yet, the memory haunted me, casting a shadow over my newfound independence. Every knock on my door became a heart-stopping moment, a reminder of that night when danger had lurked just outside my reach. As time passed, I learned to cope with the trauma, but the memory of that night never truly faded. It served as a stark reminder of the fragility of our sense of security, a reminder to cherish the moments of peace between the echoes of chaos. And in the quietude of my apartment, I vowed to live my life fully, appreciating the safety I had, while silently hoping that the elderly man found the peace he so desperately sought, even in the recess of his troubled mind. The dense Maine woods always felt like a second home to me. My love for camping had been ingrained in me since childhood, and it was a passion I was fortunate enough to share with my wife. We were a team, navigating the wilderness together, and those experiences brought us closer than ever. We were the kind of couple who found solace in the untamed, seeking refuge far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was on one of these adventures, deep in the heart of Maine, that we encountered a chilling enigma that would haunt my thoughts for years to come. It was a few years ago, during a 10-day backpacking trip, that we found ourselves in a secluded paradise. We had deliberately wandered off the trail, seeking solitude beneath a canopy of trees. Carrying all the supplies we needed, we embraced the freedom of being surrounded by nature's untouched beauty. Normally, I preferred to sleep under an open sky, but that night, the drizzle forced us to set up a small 2-person tent. It was snug inside, and soon after, the sound of raindrops on the fabric roof lulled us into a deep sleep. I awoke with the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent walls. Careful not to wake my wife, I stepped outside to start my day. That's when I saw him. A figure, about 30 feet from our tent, standing motionless, his eyes fixated on me. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. He looked like he had walked straight out of a horror movie, the embodiment of the creepy dude who murders campers. My heart raced, and I mustered a weak attempt at humor. "Good morning. Please don't eat me." His response was a chilling silence, his eyes drilling into mine for a few unbearable seconds before he turned and vanished into the woods. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. How had he found us in this remote wilderness? And what was his intent? The encounter left me on edge for the rest of our expedition. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. The beauty of the woods was tainted by an unsettling presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As we continued our journey deeper into the wilderness, my thoughts were consumed by the stranger. I wondered about the path that had led him to our tent that morning. Had he been a lost wanderer, or something far more sinister? Each night, I scanned the perimeter of our campsite, listening intently for any signs of his presence. My wife began to ask me questions about why I was being paranoid like that all the time, so I finally had to tell her about the encounter, and though she shared my concerns, she tried her best to calm me down. We pressed on, determined not to let the stranger rob us of the joy we found in the wilderness. But deep down, I knew I would never forget that moment. Upon our return to civilization, I became obsessed with finding answers, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. I scoured news articles, hoping to find any mention of a suspicious person in that area, but my efforts proved futile. Sadly, I never went back to that area, scarred about what happened that morning in the beautiful wilderness of Maine. In the heart of the Arizona desert, Canyon de Chelly, I had set up camp on the Native American reservation. Little did I know that this night would transform into a trauma etched into my memory forever. As I lay half awake, lost in the realm between sleep and consciousness, suddenly, a violent shake of my tent jolted me fully awake. Outside of my tent, a voice, rough and threatening, shattered the stillness promising harm and chaos. My heart raced, and I fumbled for something to defend myself, but my hands found nothing but the fabric of the tent walls. "Can I help you?" I managed to croak, my voice laced with a mix of fear and confusion. But the words just hung in the air, unanswered, as the unseen intruder continued. "My boys are coming over, and we're going to mess you up." In the grip of fear, I longed for some form of protection, but I had no weapon to shield myself from the unknown danger just outside of my tent. If I had possessed a firearm at that moment, the impulse to defend myself might have driven me to shoot blindly through the tent. It was a scary thought, the realization that fear could twist my instincts into something cruel like that. Minutes felt like hours, as the threat outside persisted. Then, a new sound ripped through the night. The unmistakable sound of my truck door being wrenched open and slammed shut, over and over again. My mind raced with the possibilities of what might be happening to my vehicle, my only means of escape. A tense silence followed, broken only by the pounding of my heart. Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided I couldn't stay hidden any longer. Slowly and silently, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. I saw a shadowy figure sitting in the driver's seat of my truck, the interior light casting glimmers across his face. Panic seized me. My phone, the lifeline connecting me to help, was inside of my truck. Without a second thought, I dashed toward neighboring tents like 100 yards away, desperately waking up fellow campers, telling them what happened and asked if I could use their phone. The responses were a mix of fear and reluctance. 3 people turned me away, their faces twisted with apprehension, until a compassionate couple agreed to help. With shaking hands, I dialed 911, my voice cracking as I relayed the terrifying events unfolding in the wilderness. Soon after, the flashing lights of a police car pierced through the darkness, a beacon of hope in my hour of desperation. The local cops arrived. Their authoritative presence gave me comfort. They swiftly located the source of my terror, a drunken 19-year-old, passed out in my truck, surrounded by my belongings, my phone, my iPod, and other personal items stuffed into his pockets. The police officers handled the situation with ease, escorting the intoxicated intruder away in their car. As I watched him being driven away, a wave of relief washed over me. I had survived the night, but the experience left a mark on me. Afterwards, I reflected on the incident, grappling with the knowledge that fear nearly had propelled me into a dangerous choice. The absence of a weapon had spared an innocent young man from my misguided fear-fueled actions. What would have happened if I had a gun next to me in my tent on that night? I was just 16, eager for adventure and camaraderie. The night was serene, illuminated by the warm glow of the campfire, the laughter of my friends, and a comforting aroma of s'mores and hot cocoa. Under the vast blanket of stars, we felt invincible, shielded by the presence of 4 adult men who were supposed to protect us. Inside our tent, me and my 2 companions were engaged in typical teenage chatter, when I noticed a strange sound. A ragged, heavy breathing, as if someone had just sprinted a marathon. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to my imagination. Perhaps it was one of the guys in the neighboring tent, I reasoned, making weird noises in his sleep or something. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more urgent. Then, amidst the forest sounds, a weak, desperate voice pierced through the air. "Please, help me." It wasn't a voice belonging to any member of our group. It sounded like an elderly man, fragile and terrified. The three of us fell silent, our eyes widening in mutual dread. The voice came again, this time ending in a pitiful whimper. The guy at the front of the tent, perhaps motivated by equal parts of curiosity and concern, grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the inner flap, revealing a pair of bare, skinny, and ghostly pale legs. It was a sight that sent shivers down my spine. The legs of a man who had clearly been wandering naked through the woods for a long time. The man pleaded for help, but he remained rooted in his place, as if paralyzed by fear or uncertainty. Fear gripped our hearts as we exchanged bewildered glances. "Keep walking down the trail," my friend at the front stammered, his voice barely audible. "A ranger should be around soon." It was a feeble attempt to both console the stranger and protect ourselves from whatever bizarre situation we had stumbled upon. But the man's response shattered any sense of reassurance we might have mustered. His breathing stopped abruptly, and he declared, No rangers, they keep me here." His words hung in the air like an ominous prophecy, chilling us to the bone. Finally, one of the chaperones emerged from his tent, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. He approached the stranger cautiously, his voice laced with concern, as he asked, "How long have you been out here? What happened to you?" The old man, however, offered no explanation. Instead, he succumbed to sobs that seemed to echo through the night, filling the air with an unsettling sense of despair. With a burst of energy, the man sprinted away from us, disappearing into the woods like a phantom. The beam of the flashlight revealed his skinny, naked form, a shocking sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. We were left standing there, our minds struggling to comprehend the bizarre encounter. The campsite that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed alien and menacing. We huddled together, our sense of security shattered, and contemplated the implications of what had just happened. Who was the old man, and what had happened to him? And most importantly, why was he so paranoid about encountering rangers? As the night wore on, we clung to one another, our fear refusing to dissipate. Sleep remained elusive, our minds plagued by the haunting image of those pale, scabbed legs and the desperate plea for help that pierced through the night. Little did we know that our peaceful camping trip had transformed into a scary mystery, one that would continue to haunt our thoughts long after we left the woods behind, forever changed by the inexplicable terror that had befallen us on that fateful night.